Raiden Shogun, who sparked a lot of controversy when she was first released, is getting her first ever rerun, and after a long time, here is the updated meta position for Raiden and if you should pull on her for this rerun or not. But before that, as always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Anyway, let's get started. Currently, Raiden is played in multiple different meta teams, with the main one being either Raiden National or Raiden Hypers. While Raiden is highly rated by many people, personally, to be honest, I think Raiden is, well, not necessarily overrated, but overestimated by a lot of people, which I'll slowly explain what does that really mean. But anyway, to begin, Raiden National or Raiden in general is extremely easy to use, and her elemental bursts allow her to never be interrupted. So by standing on a Bennett elemental burst with your Raiden, you are basically invincible. You can kind of think of it as having a invincible Zhongli shield, but on top of that, just doing a bunch of damage as well. Raiden gameplay loop is extremely simple and can solve a lot of the basic gameplay issues that many inexperienced player might come into contact with. Just like how a lot of player might prefer the comfortness that Zhongli can bring, many would actually like to prefer the comfort that Raiden can also bring. But just like Zhongli, strictly speaking, in terms of meta, it doesn't really mean that these characters is stronger than others just because they're more preferred. It just means they are easier to use, and which is why Raiden is overestimated. Raiden is a Archon that generates you energy, but while Raiden Shogun can generate you energy and lead to a quote-unquote DPS increase for your other characters since you don't have to build as much energy recharge, Raiden Shogun does not trivialize your energy requirement, which is a really common misconception. Raiden generate about a 20 to 25 flat energy in total, and it does not scale with energy recharge, which is actually not a lot at all. You're still gonna have to run energy recharge on your other characters. It's not like you can just run 0 energy recharge and magically have your burst up on your other characters. What she actually does is smooth out your energy level at the very top, which make your rotation overall much more comfortable and easier to use. In order for you to actually gain damage by using the quote-unquote lower energy requirement on your other character, you have to precisely adjust the amount of energy recharge on each of your characters. For example, you can switch from a Sacrificial Sword Xing Shields to a Lion Roar Xing Shields, but you still have to maintain a good amount of energy recharge, which will come from your substats. In practice, this might be hard to do because in Genshin Impact, you cannot freely adjust your stat. Your stat is dependent on artifact RNG, which means, well, the way you have to adjust your stat will come down to artifact RNG and a lot of artifact RNG. What most people actually end up doing is they will run the exact same Xing Shields with Sac Sword anyway, and then they will run a Raiden on top, which means they overcap energy by a lot, and it's the reason why it feels like Raiden always generate you your elemental burst, because you dramatically overcap on energy recharge, which mean you get an increased amount of comfort. Nevertheless, Raiden still provide a damage increase to your other characters anyway through the elemental burst damage bonus increase in her elemental skills. So Raiden does provide damage increase to your other characters, just not as much, especially in terms of the decreased energy recharge requirement. Let's take a look at a concrete example, which is International versus Raiden National. Both of those are a variation of a national team, and to be honest, I would argue that International is the better variation than Raiden National because it is able to function against any type of enemy while having much better AoE, which could be highly valued in the Abyss environment. The problem here is International is not trivial to play at all. It requires many different techniques such as castle double swirling, doing proper rotation with your child, funneling energy to your Xiangling, and much more. Even before Raiden released, many players just could never pick up child because the skill requirement to play that team is kind of high for the average Genshin player base. Even though International is a really good team, most players just don't have the method of bringing out the full potential that this team can offer. For example, a lot of players still don't double swirl on Kazuya even today. But in comparison, Raiden National, you just, well, click button and you attack. There is no concept of rotation outside of basic snapshotting onto your Xiangling. There isn't really a concept of funneling because, well, most people overcap on energy recharge, and you cannot get interrupted or even die as long as you are playing the team with basic knowledge because Raiden have infinite interrupt resistance. You actually cannot mess the rotation up or anything like that. It's physically impossible to mess up your gameplay when you're playing Raiden National. National. Comparing Raiden National to International, Raiden National is extremely easy to bring out near full potential for a lot of people, but the same cannot really be said for International. Most people just cannot fully utilize International at all. This kind of end up creating the illusion that Raiden is so much stronger than other characters, not because Raiden is weak, but rather they couldn't bring out the full potential for other characters, which make them appear weaker. However, even though that is the case, I actually think that is fine and it's not really a problem, which is the reason why I say Raiden is not necessarily overrated, but just overestimated. For a lot of those players, it is still true that Raiden is probably much better for them than any other characters, and in their hands, Raiden is higher potential than many other characters. Again, because of the many factors that make Raiden much easier to use. Just know that for Raiden National, the inclusion of Overload Reaction, on top of the fact that Raiden National miss out on Kazuya, which is a really good Anemo grouper, make it much harder to use for AoE environment for non-heavy enemy. And it might suffer against Abyss floor in the future that require AoE, such as fighting against Mirror Raiden or Bishop that we have previously seen in previous generation of Abyss. With the current meta around Spiral Abyss focusing on single target rather than group of ad, especially with all the boss fight, Raiden is definitely a really valuable pickup for your team, but this can be changed over time as with previous Spiral Abyss reset, which results in Venti having less and less value in the current iteration. Venti once upon a time had really high value when all the enemy were picked upable, but nowadays his value is dramatically less. So this could definitely happen the same with other characters, and it is important to remember that when you are making the decision to roll on Raiden, whether or not this affects your current team composition in a negative way. But of course, outside of Raiden National, there are many viable use cases for Raiden as well. I simply use that as an example to showcase things that Raiden can do and why Raiden might be overestimated, but there are definitely many other teams that Raiden can run. For example, if you are a owner of Yaimiko, probably should roll Raiden. Well, because Yaimiko is unplayable without Raiden, but there is also other team like Raiden Hyper, which was mentioned at the beginning of the video, which is a really good team to run even at Consellation 0. Raiden Hyper is runnable without the need of Consellation 2 Raiden or a C6 Sara. If you don't have C6 Sara, you can just use CDD as Lisa instead, and Raiden Hyper does include Kazuya and have good AoE, which means Raiden can still do really good AoE damage even outside of using Raiden National. Speaking of Consellation 2 Raiden does have one of the best Consellation in the game, which is her C2. Her C2 allows her to ignore 60% defense, which is crazily huge, and is often about a 50% damage gain for Raiden. A Raiden with C2 is certainly a really powerful unit who can dish out a tons of damage, who can also charge your party energy at the same time, but just know that a C2 Raiden is definitely not a necessity, especially in Raiden National where you care about the team overall damage more. But to be honest, as powerful as C2 is, I don't quite endorse rolling on Consellation. Rolling for 2 Consellation is rather expensive and could be hard to afford for many players. Plus, her Consellation 1 is completely useless, so you put yourself into this situation where you have to go all in all the way to C2 or it's for nothing. And that fund could easily be used to pull for another character instead, which potentially open up more gameplay option, and that could be appreciated for the ever-changing Abyss. It is still a really good Consellation that you can go after if you decided all you care is Raiden, but in general, I'm just not a huge fan of rolling for Consellation. I don't really like the mindset of just roll C2, haha. Anyhow, I think Raiden Shogun is a good character to pull for many players. For the lesser experienced player, you can get a lot of mileage out of her because of her ease of use and her easy to utilize potential. But for more experienced meta player, she could serve as a tech option against heavy boss enemy, which has been a recent trend in the current Abyss with all the 1v1 fight against the heavy enemy bosses. Just know that in terms of absolute meta, Raiden is definitely not so powerful that she is a must pull at all, because while other characters can achieve similar potential when you're playing them well. Overall, 3.5 out of 5, a great pull, better than most of the average characters. Many people can usually utilize a Raiden, really good. Anyhow, that is pretty much it for the video, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.